Hello, everybody. I am Kyle Doherty, and I will be doing a presentation on China's nuclear modernization. The beginning slide here is just a quick overview of the article and the three main points it makes about the surprise, restraint, and uncertainty of the nuclear development in China. The surprise is from the US was originally surprised that China was able to secure enough fissile material to even make bombs. The restraint is that China has an extremely strict no first use policy, which it states they cannot ever begin a nuclear engagement and must first absorb the first strike. Warheads and missiles aren't even stored in the same area. And then the uncertainty is from that China is either a developing or a developed superpower. So with the more influence that they are receiving, it is uncertain how that could influence their policy heading forward. So an overview of the early development of China shows that it began under Mao with his ambitious Banyan Sida idea, which was 8 years, 4 bombs. There has been debate over what the 4 bombs are. Originally, it was seen as to aim at 4 specific areas: Okinawa, Guam, Hawaii, Washington, which is sort of like the 4 levels of US influence in the area, and then, of course, at home. But it was more accurate to say it was about the 4 missile archetypes that Mao was interested in, which large single stage, a clustered engine, a staged missile, then of course an ICBM. Maoist view at the time was that nuclear weapons are more of a paper tiger than anything, and they are not actually meant to be used often in war. And at the beginning, there was a lot more emphasis on the R&D than the PLA, Department of Development. So instead of amassing a huge arsenal of weapons, there was a lot more emphasis on the sort of a diversity in the advancement of the weapon systems. After the Xiaoping era began in the late 70s to early 80s, there was an interruption of this advancement as the economic funds were shifted elsewhere. After the Xiaoping era had sort of reached its peak and China had opened up its economy, the PLA's influence sort of overtook the R&D influence, and its department was folded into separate areas of the People's Liberation Army. The US bombing of the embassy of China in Serbia had a big influence on the war posture in Beijing and led to an increased investment. This was the era where they were beginning to make some big leaps again in information technology and building a solid fuel ballistic missile. They reorganized their arsenal to be able to counter US or Russian more research lasers, reconnaissance, satellites, and more. However, they have held on to their no first use policy, and they have their warheads and missiles separate from each other even now. Although, since this article has written, there has been an increased push for obtainment of SLBMs, which I'm not sure if their warheads and missiles would be able to be separate at that point. So here is just an overview sort of what, at the time of this article, what was the nuclear arsenal in China. For ICBM, there is under 100, for IRBM under 20. For MRBM, there is actually only 50 expected, but they have about 100 overall missiles. Then for SLBM at the time, they hadn't been deployed yet, but I believe they were deployed shortly after this in 2018. And then there's also the development of the JL3, which is expected to launch soon as well. So as sort of an examination of where China is heading, is that their NFU, their policy where they won't ever first use nuclear weapons, is solid, but it's beginning to be seen as an impediment. The author of the article, he says he does not expect that there will ever be a formal rescinding of the policy, but for more holes to begin to be poked. The reason the policy is so ingrained is because of sort of the Maoist ideology at the beginning of the development, in the focus on R&D for a long time, instead of having it only under the control of the PLA the whole time. Things to watch which have happened more recently is that Xi Jinping, in a speech around the beginning of his time in office, he asked that the forces be put on high alert, which is uncommon for the posture in China. And they also released a research paper omitting a lot of the language usually used in the NFU. So the impact on IR would be, for the US, the issues are surrounding Taiwan, South China Sea, and the US presence in Asia to mainly protect its allies. With Russia, there is actually a very bloody history, which isn't really talked about as much because of the increasing friendliness of Russia and China. But the old military heads in China remember that it was the USSR which actually almost launched a nuclear attack on China. For the Korean Peninsula, North Korea acts as a buffer area for China, so it is unlikely that any resolution will happen there, even as there is an increasing nuclear threats out of there. And South Korea, of course, is a close American ally, so it could prompt some conflicts between the US and China. One important area to keep an eye on is the India-Pakistan area, with China having increasing border issues with India. Keeping an eye on this sort of a first ever nuclear triad is important. So the impact on US and China policy is how the author wraps up. And in the US, it has been framed as pretty much, is China a small Russia or a large North Korea? And then that's mean in the sense, are they actually more of a superpower who is having their weapons to act as an Asian equalizing force to the US's arsenal, or are they having it for their sort of legitimacy and to be seen as rival on the field? This is still a debate ongoing, but in recent years there has been a shift more towards, honestly, a third option, which is just, it's not a small Russia, but beginning to overtake and attempt to become the superpower of Asia. There in the US, there will be talks to bring China into any NPT talks upcoming as they gain more influence. A big point for US is the protection of their Asian allies, and also a continuing a development of weapons to be able to counter any advancements in China. And then for the policy debates in China, there, of course, with more influence comes more involvement in geopolitical issues. There will need to be a decision on if they want to either become a part of or begin their own NPT aspirations with the US and also local partners such as Russia and India, and also to have an eye on updating China's no first use policy. Again, ending with the overall summary of the article, the surprise is just the US at the time was surprised at the ability of China to even begin their program, and also some surprise at their restraint as well. So they sort of feed into each other. That the main restraint is in the fact that they have an extremely strict policy against first use, and that they have their warheads and missiles in separate areas, which really, it hampers any potential of a response happening sort of immediately, instead of having to absorb the brunt of the attack. And then the uncertainty is that in China, it's depending you ask, a developed or a developing superpower. So the amount of influence they're beginning to obtain, we are unsure how that will shift global opinion of nuclear